So, Chris, I know you as a writer. I know you as a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. I know you as a former journalist of the New York Times. I was wondering, what are you doing currently?
I just finished a book. I finished a book this fall called Our Class: Trauma and Transformation in American
Oh,
Prison, and then a book of my essays on war, uh, especially around the Ukraine conflict, will come out in August. And then I'll probably start another book in the fall. I'm on Substack now that RT America shut down, and so I still write a weekly column, which is published on SheerPost, but then goes out to Salon and a lot of other places. And then I do my weekly TV show that had been on Telesewer before Telesewer crashed, and then was on RT before RT crashed, and now is being produced out of Baltimore by the Real News. But everything comes out on chrishedges.substack.com.
I see. Well, I'm my prime target, my main goal is to inspire educators. And I was just wondering about your own educational background. I know there's when I talk to great thinkers like Noam Chomsky, there's a lot of criticism on the American educational system. But and yet you are a product of the American school system. And I think you're a fine product of the American school system. So I was wondering about your own experience, about your earliest memories of your own education, and how you experienced, um, well, primary school, high school, university.
So I grew up in a small farm town in upstate New York State, upstate New York, and my father was the minister, and uh, the poor. There was a mixed race, black and Indian community in the town. The slang term, derogatory term for them, were slouters. They were very poor. They lived in a segregated area, actually a place called Poly Holla, and the white administration of the school was constantly throwing these kids out of school and not allowing them back in. There was no social worker to advance their cause. That became my father's job. And then finally, my father was furious, of course, because it was really a very concerted and overt effort to deny these kids an education, as their parents had been denied an education. And although my father never espoused any kind of violence, or the principal put a restraining order, so my father wasn't even allowed to come on school property to advocate for these kids and their families. And that created a kind of turbulence. And I was academically gifted, and so I got a scholarship at the age of 10 to a boarding school in Deerfield, Massachusetts, called Eaglebrook. I think I was one of 16 kids on scholarship there. So
Mhm.
I went through the private school system. In the British call it public school, but
Yeah, yeah.
all the way through, and then went to Colgate University, a small liberal arts college, majored in English. I mean, it was interesting. I was a very good student in high school, but by the time I got to college, I read a lot, but a lot of it was never assigned. In fact, when I went to graduate school at Harvard, my Shakespeare professor, I was an English major,
Mhm.
wrote a letter and said, "Well, he's read more than probably any student I've ever taught." Unfortunately, not very much of it was assigned. And I read Brothers Karamazov at least twice in college, neither of which was for a course. If I was close to several professors, and if they recommended books, I read them. And if I got halfway through a book that I thought wasn't worth finishing, I didn't, even if it was on the syllabus. So I kind of used college the right way. It hurt my GPA, but not enough to keep me out of Harvard. And then I was spent 3 years getting a theology degree, a Master of Divinity, which is preparation for clergy. But then at the same time did a full year of graduate English at Harvard, and then eventually went back and did a fellowship at Harvard, where I did a year of classics. So it was a very traditional um, educational background, including Greek and Latin, which you don't get anymore, including grammar, which they don't teach anymore.
Mhm.
So, I was fortunate in that I did, uh, I was given probably the best of the American educational system.
But I can imagine you didn't read from Howard's in people's history back then, or books like that. A
No, I did.
traditional.
No, not they weren't assigned. That was the point. I read Chomsky all the time.
Mhm.
Uh, I uh, I read outside the classroom. I use the time and the resources, and not just the library, but I developed very close relationships with several professors. And I mean, my mentor at Colgate University, Coleman Brown, I used to meet with him every Friday. And he shoved one book after another into my hands, which I read, none of which were ever assigned for course, including a lot of poetry, which I then memorized, Auden and Yeats and others, and a lot of Shakespeare.
Because just what you said, you read outside of the classroom. Of course, these kinds of books aren't assigned to students. How it since works, Noam Chomsky. I can imagine when you go to a traditional American school, those books are probably banned from classrooms, aren't they?
You might find Zen, but uh, yeah, they're very. It's probably better to say infrequently taught. I don't know if they're banned, but they're infrequently taught. There's a lot of hostility among the administration to people like Zinn and Chomsky. Uh, so uh, if you want to explore their works, you're right. You pretty much have to do that independently. Not just them, but
Yeah.
C.L.R. James. I mean, there's all sorts of Marx isn't taught. I didn't read Marx in school, but I read him after. Uh, so it's a very constrained curriculum. That's correct.
Paulo Freire is also a name that was banned in
Yeah.
certain states. Yeah. So Noam Chomsky once told me that the school system, especially universities, act as a kind of filter to see who is obedient and knows how to behave according to certain rules, and that grants them access to certain jobs. Do you think that's a correct way of seeing the system? That
Yeah, because for the elite schools, they're so hard to get into that
yes.
any confrontation with authority, your chances of getting in are essentially eradicated. That the students who get into those schools define themselves by how authority views them and rewards them, and that creates a kind of a type of student that gets into these universities. One that is not predisposed to rebel or particularly even to question authority. And so they work hard, they regurgitate. I mean, I found at Harvard several of my classmates, they had kind of photographic memories. They could regurgitate information.
Hmm.
They couldn't do much with it. They couldn't process it, but they could spit it back, and so yeah, I think at the elite schools there is a kind of winnowing process whereby those who are predisposed to question or fight authority are weeded out. That's correct.
Hmm. So this educational system worked for you, but it doesn't work for many other people in the United States. If you have a look at education in the United States nowadays, what's your description?
Well, it's largely vocational. I mean, so I remain rooted in the humanities. I English, philosophy, religion, languages, uh, and now I think the largest majors at Harvard and Princeton are computer science. The humanities are kind of withering away. Uh, Princeton's now building huge engineering, biotech campus, just like Stanford and just like Harvard. So uh, there is, all through the tiered levels of the American educational system, it's all geared towards vocational training. So if you live in a poor community, you're going to be trained just enough or educated just enough to be numerically literate so you can work in a warehouse or a fast food restaurant. If you go to Princeton, you're going to be trained so that you can go work at Goldman Sachs or Citibank, but it's all vocational at whatever level you've been slotted into. I mean, the humanities themselves are designed to be subversive in a sense that they're designed to make you ask questions about assumptions and about power, about and those humanities departments at even big research universities are becoming increasingly marginalized. Very few majors, and so I would say throughout the system there's a kind of uniform thrust towards away from critical thinking, towards slotting people into the corporate state that we live in.
You didn't mention the words inequity or inequality. And when I think of the American system, I think of inequality and, well, lack of opportunities for certain kinds of peoples. A couple of years ago, I interviewed a New York professor. Her name is Diane Ravitch, and she wrote several books about the American education system. And she's especially opposed to the so-called, what's the name for these private schools? It just slipped my mind. You have the public
prep schools,
no,
or charter schools.
The charter schools, yes, especially.
Yeah, they're awful. It's all charter schools. It's educational apartheid. I mean, she's done really good work on this, but it's a way you have to test to get in. They won't take ESL. They won't take students with learning disabilities. They leave those in the public schools. They actually siphon off state funds, and it's all, and in poor neighborhoods they're even kind of militarized. So yeah, it's all about STEM. It's all about vocational training, and the humanities are not even an afterthought.
And let's move on to our class. I was moved by the many anecdotes, and one that really was this poem about the family. I can't find it right now. About the family of 5 kids, I think, and a mother which decided to leave her 5 kids. And there's so many touching story. So my first question is, Chris, why did you decide to write the book? What's the why? Why did it come to your mind to write about your work in the prison system?
Well, because it was such an amazing experience, and that if you know anything about prison teaching, they build such thick emotional walls. Even people they may be in the same cell with for years they may not even know their legal name. And in the process of writing a play about their lives, those walls disintegrated.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the grief and the trauma and the pain and the alienation and all of it came out in this play. It was accidental. I didn't plan it that way, but it became this amazingly therapeutic process by which the process of writing a play about their lives, which I use in the book to kind of expose the horror of mass incarceration and poverty within the United States. But that process, gave grief. Let sorrow speak, as Shakespeare said. I mean, it gave grief. It gave words to their grief, and for many that was the first time. I mean, many of the stories that came out that were they'd never told anyone about this stuff. And it created a kind of bond within the classroom because it was antithetical to everything of prison culture. In prison culture, it's all, you never show weakness, you never show vulnerability, you never show fear because you become prey. And in that classroom, I mean, they're big guys, a lot of them. They're holding what they'd written, their scenes, and fighting back tears and their hands are shaking. And I was teaching a drama course, so I was teaching August Wilson and Amira Baraka and James Baldwin and others, and I realized they had very little familiarity with theater. So I had them write scenes from their lives just on a whim.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out in the prison they knew that I was a writer, so I'd attracted some very talented writers, probably the most talented writers in the prison. And I saw the quality of that work and then said, well, let's try and put together a play. But it wasn't premeditated. It wasn't planned. And then it blossomed into this amazing experience. And then eventually the play was published and eventually it was performed in a professional theater, sold out every night. And but it uses that process of writing the play to really look at the horror of mass incarceration and the dislocation in de-industrialized urban areas of these people and their families.
How did you end up teaching in a prison in the first place?
So I have a friend who runs the history department at the College of New Jersey, Celia Chazelle, and this was before, so this was through Rutgers University, but this was before there was any college program. So after they finished their high school equivalency or their GED, there was nothing for them. So she was going in on her own and teaching a full semester course. And then if they completed the coursework, she'd print out on her home printer that they had done the work. Now, it didn't have any academic validity, but it went into their folder. And when they went before the probation board, it showed the positive work that they had done in the classroom. And so I started, because of that, I actually taught Zinn's People's History of the United States.
Yeah.
And then in 2013, Rutgers started this college degree program, and so I've been teaching in that ever since.
It's called NJ STEP, isn't it?
Yeah, NJ STEP.
And it means, what does it mean again?
New Jersey.
New Jersey. Yeah.
Scholastic transfer.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I should know. But
So,
no.
one of the things you mentioned in the book is that the crime numbers have declined, and yet the incarceration numbers have doubled.
Well, yeah, because it's a form of social control. You as Durkheim would say, you rupture the social bonds that knit you to a society, work, a sense of place, and an ability to feel that you're worth something within the society and a kind of meritocracy, and all of that's gone. The schools don't work, and so you rupture those social bonds, and then the only two forms of social control you have left are prisons and militarized police. So that's why we have the largest prison population in the world. 40% of the people in our prison population have not been charged with physically harming another person. We can lock people up for life for drugs. But it's the form of social control. You remove the men largely from the community, although I've also taught in the women's prison in New Jersey. You lock up the men and you evict the women and children, because with no economic stability, they never stay in a place. I mean, with my students, 6 months, they go to 3 different schools in a year, and then of course drop out about 8th or 9th grade. 40% of the people coming into the prison system in the United States are illiterate. I believe 40% is the right figure. It's somewhere around there. They don't read or write at all. And it essentially functions to destroy any sense of cohesiveness or community or any ability to fight back and resist. And that's how it's designed. It functions as the way it's designed.
So you say 40% of prisoners, more or less, is illiterate. And for those people, they don't have entrance access to your classes, do they?
Well, no, I have students in the class who came into prison illiterate. But they went through the high school equivalency program. They learned to read and write in prison.
I see. Yeah. So you also stated, or maybe in an interview, I don't remember, that there are more people incarcerated now than there were slaves 1 year prior to the American Revolution.
Yeah,
am I right?
That and on probation. We have 2.3 million if you count also people who have felony convictions, probation, that's right. It's larger than. It's appalling, and when you get inside the system and see the cruelty of it, the violence, the use of extreme sensory deprivation to break people down in cells, the prolonged solitary confinement. It's absolutely an appalling system.
You describe your class, it's called our class, but you have to agree with me that there is a purpose to prison systems. Some people should be locked up. So there's a threshold level, I think, a border when I mean, prisons serve a purpose. They make society safer in some way, and you have to agree with me that some people are locked up for some very good reasons. So how would you improve a prison system like this?
Well, I would improve the system by making sure a prison is run so that people are not abused and re-traumatized, so that they get out and they're even more dangerous than when they went in. That would be the first. Second of all, huge numbers of people within the prison system have severe mental health issues. But because, courtesy of Ronald Reagan, we destroyed our mental health system, we just had, these mass shootings are often carried out by people with extreme emotional problems, obviously. So you have about 25% of the prison population has severe mental health problems, and they don't treat them; they drug them. So they just give them sedatives. So they sleep 18 hours a day, and you can see them. They go down to the mess hall and their hands shake, and it's a system that doesn't restore or in any way address many of the severe psychological and emotional issues that they carry within the prison. In fact, it exacerbates it and makes it worse. Yes, there are certainly people, I've taught them. I've taught psychopaths, kind of very frightening figures who you don't want walking the streets. But again, that's a mental health issue. Our sentences are 2 or 3 times longer than anywhere else in the world. I always tell my students, I ask them, to guess how long Gabriel Princip, who assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie.
First World War, yeah.
It's 20 years. I got guys in there for 20 years. They never committed a violent crime. So if it's about rehabilitation, I'm fine. I mean, look at the Finnish system. I don't know how it is where you are, but that should be the role of prisons. We shouldn't be putting these people back out into society more enraged and more traumatized and less able to take care of themselves. 76% of the people in the American prison system go back into prison after 5 years because they're thrown into this criminal caste system where they can't get jobs, they can't get public housing, they can't get support. They're kind of branded. We have to remember that the prison industrial complex in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And their lobbyists are the ones who are determining what the prisons look like. And the goal is to keep people there for a really long time. And if they get out, to make sure they get back in. That's how they make their money.
In the book, you mentioned the food supplier. The food supplier alone is a billion-dollar industry.
Yeah, and it's predatory on the poorest of the poor. So we talk about private prisons, which exist, but everything in prisons, state and federal prisons, have been privatized. The money transfer, JPay, the RMART, for instance, the food service, Global Tellink, the phone service, the commissary is privatized, the medical is privatized, everything's privatized. And of course, the people who have to pay, so they can earn anything in a prison, you earn, I think, $28
for a 40-hour work week.
You 40-hour work week. So all the families have to send money in. If you want a phone card, you got to pay in advance, that kind of stuff. So it's just appalling. It's become I mean, these bodies in Newark or Camden or Detroit, they're not worth anything to the corporate state. They're what Marx calls surplus labor. But if you lock them in a cage, then they can generate $50,000 or $60,000 a year for the guards and the prison contractors and the food companies and everyone else. And that's really what it comes down to, because 94% of the people who go into prison never had a jury trial.
Yeah.
They're coerced, I don't use that word lightly, to plea out. You stack a bunch of charges against them. Both the police and the prosecutor know that you didn't commit them, and then you use them as bargaining chips. So the students that I teach with the longest sentences are almost always innocent because they foolishly went to court,
Yeah.
and none of those charges got dropped, and they don't get adequate legal representation, and they're a kind of example. People say, okay, you want to go to court? Well, look at Lawrence, look at Sabir,
Mhm.
look at whoever. These sentences are appalling. So the system would crash. It wouldn't function if they had their constitutional right to a jury trial. And so only 6% do.
So $28 for a 40-hour working week is like modern slave labor, I would say.
Yeah.
The only thing is, you mentioned a famous crook like Kuklinski, and I think most people would agree that it would be good for, well, he passed away in 2006, but it would be good for him to have a 60-hour work week for nothing because of what he did.
Well, you're talking about a mass serial killer, of
Mhm.
course. I mean, these are extreme cases, and I put them in the book because I agree. I'm not. There are people. As I said, I taught some of them that you don't want walking around, without question. But that's actually a tiny percentage. I mean, the number of real killers in a prison is minuscule. I mean, single digits in terms of percentages. Now, a lot of my students killed, but they're not killers. And in this sense, it was a fight, or it was a drive-by shooting where, I was telling my students in the war in El Salvador, which I covered for 5 years, the soldiers never wanted to get killed, so they used to get down in a ditch and take their M16 and just spray. And somebody said, oh, well, that's just like a drive-by. So, yeah, they need to do time. They don't need to do as much time as they do. I mean, people age out of crime. By the time they're in my classroom, and the average age is in the 40s, they pretty much aged out of crime.
Talk about the Three Strikes Out Act designed by no other than Joe Biden
And Clinton, yeah.
and Clinton.
Well, third drug charge, you're locked up for life. This is ridiculous. I mean, I taught a guy, when you stacked all the charges, he had 154 years. He'd not. It was all drugs and weapons charges. He'd never been charged with a violent crime.
So why did he design the Three Strikes Out Act? What was the reason for Biden and Clinton to
Well,
come up?
because they wanted to take the law and order issue away from the Republicans, and there was a whole kind of upping the ante. So I think there were like maybe one or two federal crimes that merited death penalty. Biden pushed through 51 crimes. He used to brag about it.
Mhm.
And that was a conscious effort by the Democratic Party to take the law and order issue away from the Republicans by out Republicaning the Republicans, by making them. I mean, the death penalty example is probably just one, but the three strikes are outlaws, the doubling and tripling of sentences, that all came out of the Democrats because they wanted to own that issue, and the human suffering that was engendered by that is, of course, never addressed.
27 of your students finally, in the end, graduated from Rutgers University. What story touched you most of all these stories?
Well, I don't know. They kind of all do, because I know where they came from and how they were written off since they were children, and how they just persevered despite it. They're remarkable people. I teach an elite group in the prison. I mean, that you can't get into that program if you have charges, so they have very clean disciplinary records. But they're real intellectuals. I mean, they've turned their cells into libraries. I mean, maybe Lawrence Bell in the book, he was, his parents had both died. He was I think his mother died when he was 11 or something. Anyway, he was 12, 13, living alone in an abandoned house in Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States. And as often happens in urban settings, there was a rape and a killing of a woman. He's just grabbed and picked up, dragged into a police station, forced to sign a confession. Can't read, he's illiterate. He gets to trial, he hears what he's charged with, he attempts to protest, and they ignore him. And he's at the age, remember, he's 14 as a child, he weighs 90 pounds. He's charged as an adult, and he's not eligible to go before a parole board until he's 70. Can't even ask to get out till he's 70. And he just decided to be the best person he could be in prison. Remarkable. I taught a class later, a history class called Conquest, 3 books you wouldn't normally see perhaps on college curriculums: Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. And he's an amazing student. He just works so hard, and I don't give a lot of A's. I'm kind of a hard grader, so I'll give maybe 2 or 3 a class, and he's always one of them. And he waits till the class is about to leave, or actually has got to the hall. You have a very short time from when the bell rings to get in the hall, or you get a charge. Anyway, he waited till the classroom was empty, and he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do because one day I'm going to be a teacher like you. And he walks out. So, in Lawrence, we managed through a 2-year process, because he was charged as a juvenile. There was a Supreme Court decision, the Miller case, where it said that juveniles could not be charged as adults. We got him a resentencing hearing and didn't find him innocent. He'd already served 30 years, but he got out. He went to finished his degree at Rutgers, graduated summa cum laude, and is now a community organizer. So, but that's just one of many stories. I don't know that there's one in particular, but that's an example of what you deal with. And he has no family, of course, so they won't release you unless you have an address. So I had to raise $20,000 to rent him an apartment for a year, and then my garage was filled with chairs and kitchen stuff, all donated by formerly incarcerated people, so he could get out. And I am an ordained minister. I very rarely put on a clerical collar, but I put it on for his court date. Yeah. And they don't tell you when they don't tell the order. So I got there at 10 in the morning, and the sheriff's deputy would open the door and bring someone in. By the end of the day, the courtroom was largely empty except for me in my clerical, and Lawrence is the last one. And the sheriff's deputy opens the door and turns to Lawrence and said, "Who's that effing minister?" And Lawrence says, "That's my pastor." And Lawrence is Muslim. So.
Yeah, you also wore the minister robe, whatever you call it, on the graduation ceremony.
Yeah.
You told in the book, well, I don't wear my robe very often, but for that occasion, I did.
It's a collar. I've never gone so far as to wear a robe, but
the collar, yeah, the collar. So, it's a kind of, I have to give a spoiler alert, but in the end, you perform their play, and you talk about the sobbing and the crying in the hall, and there must have been a really powerful tension in the air, especially because it concerns the mothers and the children and the relatives of these prisoners. Or former prisoners. So what has it done, all these publicity and your book, what has it resulted into? What happened afterwards?
Well, the system still as awful as it was when I wrote it. I think what it did is it gave a voice to those who were locked away. It allowed them to speak outside of those walls. That's what it did. And it was important and powerful to them, to their families, and to all the people who saw the play and heard their voices. Because the play, there's nothing in that play that didn't happen to someone in that classroom. Even these amazing moments where one of my students is locked into the Supermax prison in Trenton. And on his first night, the guard comes by and says, that's the cell your father was in. You can dream this stuff up. Going into solitary confinement, adopting mice as pets, putting like strings around their neck, keeping them as pets. So the power of it was that it made their voices heard and affirmed their dignity and their integrity. And that was the power of it. But did it in any way change the system? Unfortunately, it did not.
Is there any possible way to change the system? Is it going to change, do you think?
Well, not the system, not unless you reintegrate these people back into the society, which neoliberalism has no intention of doing. So there is one way to change the system, and it's not appealing to elected officials. It's supporting prison strikes and demands for minimum wage. Because if they paid the workers in the prison minimum wage, the system would financially not be sustainable. That's the best route we have to at least breaking the size of it. 25% of the world's prison population is in the United States. We're less than 5% of the world's population.
And you personally, do you have hope that it is going to change?
I covered war for 20 years. I don't share the American mania for hope. I also studied a lot at Calvin. I often say I don't fight fascists because I'm going to win. I fight fascists because they're fascists.
Yeah.
It's kind of stealing a line from the memoirs of Sartre, if you've read them. But
No,
he was talking to a friend of his who was going back, I think it was 37, to fight in the Spanish Civil War. They knew the Republic was doomed at that point. And that's what he said. That's what he told Sartre. So it's that falls back on my kind of divinity school training. You fight. You don't fight evil because you're going to win. You fight it because it's evil. And do I have any kind of hope? Well, I have a pretty dark view of human nature. We're not responding to the climate crisis in any rational way. It's a pretty bleak future. But if you stop resisting, then you can't use the word hope. And I think for me, that's where real spirituality comes, is in that struggle with what Kant would call radical evil. King writes about this quite eloquently in the end of his book, Strength to Love, after they've thrown a bomb into his house.
You reported wars for 20 years, and you are an ordained minister. I was wondering, Chris, where do you place God? You've seen so many wrongdoings, so many killings, children being shot, families being torn apart, all those brutal murders and wars, and still you are a minister. How do you explain it to yourself, and where is God in the whole story?
Right. Well, we live in a morally neutral universe, without question. And some people said, well, 45 foreign reporters were killed in Sarajevo. And people said, well, you survived for a reason. And I said, no, that's just obscene to say that when 2,000 children died in that city. So are you telling me that my life was somehow more important or more precious in the eyes of some divine being than a child? I once asked Daniel Berrigan, the great radical priest who baptized my youngest daughter, how he defined faith, and he said the belief that the good draws to it the good. Even if empirically everything around you says otherwise, and the Buddhists call it karma, but in the Christian religion we don't know where it goes. But I believe that's right. I believe the good does draw to it the good. Some sociologists and psychologists call these phantoms, these figures, moral figures that you carry with you, including like my father, who no longer are living, but you carry that. I think morality can't be taught. I think it can only be shown. And so, I cover the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. But when I was in Prague, I was in Wenceslas Squares, 500,000 Czechs. It was December, snowing, and this Czech singer, Marta Kubasheva, came out on the balcony. Now, she had been the most popular, certainly one of the most popular singers pre-1968 in Czechoslovakia. And then when the Soviets invaded in 68, she sang this anthem of defiance called A Prayer for Marta. And when Dubček was overthrown and the pro-Soviet regime was installed, her recording stock was destroyed. She was banned from the airwaves, and she had spent the intervening years working on an assembly line at a toy factory. And she came out and began to sing A Prayer for Marta, and every Czech in the crowd knew every word. Most of that crowd had been born after 68. So there's a kind of example of how the good draws to it the good. And I think that's a pretty good definition for me of what faith is. That you don't carry out what you, I mean, everything I fought for in my lifetime, going all the way back to the wars in Central America, on every single aspect is worse. But I don't think that invalidates what I've done.
I was just wondering how, when you see a mass grave and you see children killed, do you ever wonder where is God? How do you process such events for yourself? Do you look at it just from a journalistic perspective? Do you separate it? Or
Well, at the moment, yeah, you have to. I mean, so when you're dealing with that as a journalist, you're numb. I mean, you may have an emotional reaction later, but you're attempting to gather information to write a story, even if the bodies are lying at your feet. So yeah, you don't, if you, there is a kind of clinical quality of that kind of work, which doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you later, but in the moment, you can't do your work if it does. There were moments, of course, when it was affected. So how do you process it? Well, because I understand, let's go back to that notion of radical evil. How radical evil is real, and those who stand up to face radical evil usually accept their own self-sacrifice. I mean, their own demise, and that often is the case. Whether it's Oscar Romero in El Salvador, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I mean, that persistent fight against radical evil often costs you your own life. But within that circle of evil, there is always this light, this goodness. So, for instance, when a shell, I was in Sarajevo, was being hit with about 300 shells a day. There was no water system, so people had to gather around collective water taps, and the Serb gunners knew where they were, and they'd wait until people congregated to get the water, and they'd drop these heavy shells, 155 howitzers or the Soviet equivalent, and 90 millimeter tank rounds. I mean, really big stuff. And it would just blow people to smithereens. I mean, just eviscerate people. And you could feel palpably these rings of kind of death emanating out from this horrible atrocity. And yet at the same time, loved ones, families, friends would push forward to try and find people who were wounded and that they could save. And it was this kind of alternating wave. I mean, you could feel it of life and death, of, let's call it good and evil. And I was a prisoner in Basra. I was taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard after the first Gulf War, and eventually turned over to the secret police, and it was very brutal and unpleasant, and I didn't know if they were going to kill me. And it was the roofs and back. I was in Basra, but then I was eventually transferred by the Republican Guard to Baghdad and turned over to the secret police, Muhabarat. And I hadn't eaten for 24 hours or had water or anything. And the roofs in Baghdad are flat. And in the morning, the women and children would get up on the roofs and bake bread. And I speak Arabic, and I yelled out that I was an American. We just bombed their country. And I was a journalist, and I hadn't eaten it. And the mothers gave the children this bread to scamper across the roofs to give me. So when I think back on being held in that room by the police, and I was roughed up and everything else, I invariably think of that memory. I don't know whether it's psychological exit or defense or whatever, but it was the power of that, of solidarity and of compassion, and overrides, at least for me, the psychological trauma that I endured in that cell. So, good and evil are real. It's an eternal battle. It'll never end. And but is there a divine being or a great watchmaker? I don't know. I don't come out of that. I've seen too much of how the world works.
Yeah, well, I think they gave you the bread listening to your story because you speak Arabic and you respect their culture by speaking Arabic. Which American speaks Arabic, especially GIs in Iraq? They don't speak Arabic. They don't show that kind of respect. So if you speak Arabic, of course, you gain respect very quickly, I think.
Yeah, well, that's true everywhere. I mean, that's why I worked so hard to learn the languages of whatever conflict I was in. Yeah, so it's just common courtesy. No, they didn't speak. The occupation forces spoke one language. That was the language of violence. That's it. They didn't know other way to communicate, and they weren't interested in any other way of communicating.
What language did you speak in Bosnia?
I did not speak Serbo-Croatian now, but that wasn't my fault. I was in Cairo, and I was supposed to go in the fall, and I had a Serbo-Croat tutor in Cairo so that I could learn it. And then the ceasefire broke down in May, and the correspondent who was there did not want to go back in, kind of understandable. It was incredibly dangerous, and I had 2 days to get on a plane. And when you're writing, 6, 7 stories a week, you don't have any time. So that was the one conflict I covered where I did not speak the language, and it hurt me. You're separated from the culture. I mean, I worked for the New York Times, so there's no shortage of translators and all sorts of people to assist me, but it's not the same.
It's not the same, and I'm sure the quality and the depth of your articles is very different from the ones you've written.
Yeah, that's true.
Speaking Arabic. Yeah, but of course the Bosnia war didn't last for 20 years like the Iraq war did, so you didn't have that much time to prepare and learn the language.
Well, I learned Arabic before. I learned Arabic because I was in the Middle East in '88, so I learned Arabic before either the first or the second Gulf War.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I learned Arabic because I was going to be stationed in the Middle East.
Yeah, for the New York Times as a.
Well, I was originally there for the Dallas Morning News, and then I was hired by the New York Times.
Yeah. Which you left in 2005, I guess, because you were publicly opposing the Iraq invasion.
Right. Yeah, they issued me a reprimand and forbade me to speak about the war, and I left.
Yeah.
They gave me the reprimand in 2003. I knew I had to leave, but what I did is worked with a foundation at the time, the Nation Institute, and they raised the money to replicate the salary that I was getting at the Times, and then I left and went there.
I see. Yeah. And just to end our interview, you are writing a book about Ukraine.
No, I wrote a series of articles because I was in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the communist regimes, and I was very aware, number one, of the quote-unquote peace dividend, and that we wouldn't expand the borders of NATO beyond a unified Germany, and then just saw, I followed it. So I wrote some columns, Chronicle of a War Foretold, The Pimps of War, and this led a publisher to say, let's take those columns with your other essays on war over the last 20 years and put them together in a book, which they did, called The Greatest Evil is War, which will be out in August.
Okay, because you already handed in the manuscript, so it doesn't contain Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and I see.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, and I'd like to end by thanking you for your time. It was very, very nice to talk to you, Chris.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Liz Hill too, by the way, who made it possible to do this interview, because she contacted you and made this talk possible. So I hope to talk to you again about inverted totalitarianism, but first I'm going to do my homework, and I'm going to let this talk simmer. And well, thank you, Chris, for your time, and I hope to see you next time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.